I knew my body was changing, but I never imagined my life would transform like this. I looked in the mirror, and for a second I wondered who was staring back at me. The grayer hair, the faint lines on my face that weren't there before. I was 35, and the weight of routine crushed me more than any expectation. What happened to the woman who dreamed, who believed in love and passion, who gave herself without fear? Where had she hidden? With every cup of coffee sipped in silence, with every hour passing without allowing myself to think of anything else, the emptiness grew deeper, more suffocating. My life, which once seemed full, now felt like a mere replica of the choices I'd made in the past. A prison made of safety, the kind of life others expected of me. But then he appeared again. He was a man from my past, one of those you try to forget, but who returns when you least expect it. He looked at me as if he knew exactly what was happening inside me, as if he held a key to all the doors I'd forced shut. His smile was the same, that smile full of promises and secrets, capable of making any woman look away and get lost. I wanted to hate him for it, for making me feel more vulnerable than I was willing to admit. But the truth was, he had this power over me, a power he never knew, and now suddenly it seemed impossible to ignore. When he said my name, everything around me vanished. There was no longer the sound of the street outside, nor the gentle breeze slipping through the half-open window. All I could hear was him, the sound of his voice, low and familiar, telling me he needed to talk. "I know I hurt you," he said, and those words, which I thought I'd buried long ago, hit me like a wave. I stood there, unsure what to do, how to react. My heart raced, and for a moment I felt as if I were back in that time when love seemed easier, more possible. But it wasn't easier anymore. It wasn't possible anymore. It was just fear. Fear of giving in again. Fear of being swept away by something I knew I couldn't control. But he wouldn't leave. He was there in front of me. And the life I'd tried to build on safety crumbled with the unspoken promise that he'd make me feel again. I tried to push him away, to ignore the spark in his eyes, that familiarity I'd hidden somewhere inside me. But he didn't give up. Every word he spoke felt like an invitation to relive something I'd decided never to remember. And yet, there he was, like a half-open door I couldn't stop looking at, even knowing only darkness lay on the other side. With every casual encounter, a conversation, a quick glance, a light touch, I felt the walls I'd built around my heart begin to crack. I didn't want to let myself go. I didn't want, under any circumstances, to repeat past mistakes. But there was something about him that disarmed me, something I couldn't ignore, even though my instincts screamed to run, to keep my distance. But how do you run from something already inside you, something you'd loved without reservation, but now seemed impossible to rediscover? The truth is, he made promises, not with clear words, but with subtle gestures, with that deep look full of longing and guilt. He told me he was different, that he'd changed, that he'd learned his lesson. I didn't know what to believe. How could I trust someone who'd left before? How could I believe he was there to stay when every fiber of my being was yelling to protect myself, to not let myself be pulled into the whirlwind again? He spoke about the lost time, the years that could never be reclaimed, but there was something in the way he spoke that felt more like an excuse than an explanation. I felt the weight of his words, but also the weight of my own doubts. I wanted to believe him, wanted it to be true, but fear paralyzed me. With each passing day, I found myself more entangled. I began questioning my own choices, my decisions, how much I'd closed myself off to love, how much I truly wanted to change. How could he make me feel so much? How could someone who'd hurt me so deeply still have this power over me? But deep down, there was a truth I couldn't ignore. I still loved him, not in an idealized way like before. It was a deeper, perhaps more mature love, but also more confused, more laden with fear and insecurity. And yet I couldn't push him away. He still occupied a space within me, and that terrified me. I knew I was at a crossroads, that the decisions I made from that moment on could change the course of my life. He was there, in front of me, trying to convince me that this time would be different. But I was scared, so deeply terrified of giving in again, of exposing myself to something that could destroy me once more. What to do? Move forward and try, again, or keep the walls I'd built with such effort? I found myself lost between those two possibilities, unsure which to choose. I didn't know what to do anymore. Every time he appeared, I grew more confused, more lost. The time between our encounters grew shorter, the distance between us thinner. I tried to convince myself I was in control, that there was nothing he could say or do to change what I'd already decided. But the problem was I no longer knew what my decision was. He seemed to have this power over me, this ability to make me question everything I believed to be true, about love, about pain, about forgiveness. How did he do it? How did he make me forget the pain he caused? How did he make me somehow believe he was truly there to stay? The moment of decision came without warning. I was at home, alone, with the phone in my hands. He'd called earlier saying he needed to talk, that he wanted to see me. I knew that moment would come. I knew he wouldn't give up trying, and I also knew that deep down, I still wanted to hear what he had to say. But at the same time, I feared this would be the moment he'd finally leave me again, without explanation, without words. It was the fear of abandonment that had always been with me, this silent monster hiding in the shadows of every choice I made, every relationship I tried to start. I stared at the phone longer than usual, my finger hovering over the screen. I felt my heart tight in my chest, my pulse racing, and for a moment I wondered if I could bear another pain. But at the same time, there was an inner voice, almost whispering, telling me I was ready to make the hardest choice of my life. It was the choice to believe him, to set aside my fears, to finally give him the chance to prove he could stay. But it was also the choice to give myself a chance to love again, without fear, without reservation. I knew that meant opening myself to pain, but I also knew pain was part of love, that without it, there was no growth, no true connection. And so, without hesitating any longer, I pressed the call button. When he answered, his voice was soft, but there was something there, an expectation, a sincere desire, that made all my doubts dissolve for a moment. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't make empty promises. He simply said, "I'm here, and I'm not running anymore. I know what you fear, but if you let me, I'll stay. I promise." And in that instant, his words, simple and direct, stirred something in me I couldn't ignore. The promise not to run, the promise to be present. That was what I needed to hear. Not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to face his fears and mine together. I knew in that moment that something was starting to change, that this was my chance to start over, to finally give a chance to this love I'd held on to for so long. With a trembling but determined voice, I replied, "I'm willing. I'm not running anymore either." And the moment those words left my mouth, I felt a lightness. It wasn't a guarantee that everything would be easy, but it was the beginning of something that for the first time felt genuine. He wasn't running anymore. And I, finally, was ready to stay. The weeks that followed were marked by a strange mix of closeness and distance. He was there, always present, trying to show he'd truly changed, that the promise not to run was serious, but inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still holding back, protecting himself. It couldn't just be me. I needed to know. He was also willing to give himself fully, without barriers, without fears, and I found myself increasingly torn between believing in his transformation and the insecurity of seeing signs that he still carried ghosts from the past. Our conversations, which once flowed easily, began to be interrupted by uncomfortable silences. His gaze, at times, drifted, as if something inside him was fighting to come out, but he didn't want me to see. I could feel the weight of everything left unsaid, and it bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. I wanted him to be completely transparent, to see in him the certainty that he was truly willing to not turn back, to not hide. But as he spoke, there was something in his tone, a slight hesitation, that made my heart tighten with anxiety. H.T. started pulling away little by little, not with words, but with small actions, as if he were afraid of losing himself again. I knew what that meant. He was retreating, not out of malice, not because he wanted to hurt me, but because fear was still stronger than the will to move forward. And in that moment, I faced a dilemma. I wanted to believe him, to believe in the promises he made, but at the same time, I was afraid of opening up fully, of giving myself to love again, only to be left behind like last time. The weeks passed, and our conversations grew more spaced out. His smile, which once seemed so easy and confident, was now tense, as if he were struggling to maintain a facade. I knew he was trying, but what frustrated me was the sense that he was still holding back, that there was a part of him refusing to open up fully, to give himself without fear. I began to question whether what we were building was solid enough to face the life I wanted, or if he was still trapped in the past, unable to truly commit. It was one night, after a quiet dinner, that everything came to a head. He'd been silent for much of the meal, staring at his plate, with a distant glint in his eyes. I watched him in silence, trying to understand what was going on, until finally he looked at me, as if mustering the courage to speak. "I'm trying," he said, his voice almost inaudible, "but it's still hard for me." That simple sentence was like a punch to the stomach, not because it was a surprise, but because I already knew. I knew he was fighting something inside him, something he couldn't show me. "Hard?" I asked, feeling the tension rise between us. "Hard how?" His response was vague, evasive. He spoke about the fear of getting hurt, of failing again. And with that, I understood he hadn't yet done the work of forgiving himself, of freeing himself from the chains of the past. I knew his change wouldn't come overnight, but hearing it made me realize that perhaps I was expecting more than he could offer at that moment. In that instant, part of me wanted to give up, wanted to say it was okay, that I understood, that I couldn't expect more from him, but instead, I asked what he needed from me, what he expected from me, how I could help him overcome the fears still holding him back. And that's when he finally opened up a little more. He told me about the failures he carried, the mistakes he couldn't forget, the fear of giving himself and being rejected again. He was fighting an invisible enemy, a fear that paralyzed him with every step he took toward me. And in that moment, I realized what he needed most wasn't just my support, but my patience. The truth was, he hadn't run from me, but from himself, from his own insecurities. I sat there listening to him attentively, feeling a mix of compassion and frustration. I loved him, but at the same time, I felt myself losing control of the situation, waiting for something he wasn't yet ready to give. And that hurt me in a subtle but constant way. With every word he spoke, I felt myself drifting further, more, distant from the love I'd hoped for, from the promise he'd made. And in that moment, the doubt grew even more. Would he ever be ready? Could I keep waiting for someone who wasn't yet willing to free himself from his own past? Or was this a love that, as genuine as it was, would never reach the depth I longed for? I knew he wasn't ready for what I needed from him. The time, the conversations, the small gestures, none of it seemed enough. I wanted to see him free, fearless, willing to give himself completely, but he was still bound, still unable to break the invisible chains keeping him distant, even when he was close to me. And that was consuming me. Each day that passed, I wondered if he truly wanted to be there, if he was as willing as I was to build something real, or if all this was just his attempt to convince himself he still had the capacity to love. I found myself losing patience, even knowing love shouldn't be rushed, but the doubt began to weigh on me, and the fear that my vulnerability might be in vain made me think that perhaps I'd have to move on alone. It was one of those days when he pulled away again, without explanation, without words, that I decided to confront him. I couldn't live in this uncertainty anymore, in the emotional roller coaster he put me on. That day, I was sitting in the living room, waiting, when he finally showed up. He looked visibly tired, his eyes betraying sleepless nights and unresolved thoughts. When he walked in, the silence between us was almost unbearable. I knew what was coming, and he knew too. "I can't live like this anymore," I said, without mincing words. He looked at me, surprised, as if he hadn't expected me to put everything into such direct words. "You say you won't run anymore, but you keep pulling away. I need to know if you're really here, if you really want to stay." The tension in the air grew thicker. He sat in the chair across from me but said nothing. His expression was one of regret, but also desperation. He wanted me to believe him, but I didn't know if I could anymore. Then he did something I didn't expect. He stood and walked to the window. He looked outside, not really seeing anything, then turned to me, with a look deeper than anything I'd ever seen in him. "I know I hurt you," he began, his voice steady, but laden with a sincerity I couldn't ignore. "I promised I wouldn't run anymore, and even when it seems like I'm pulling away, I'm here. I just need more time to find myself, to let myself be the man you deserve." He approached me, and for the first time, there were no barriers. He was vulnerable, open, willing to be real, without masks. I looked at him and felt the weight of his words. It was as if he were finally handing me the truth. No more excuses. But at the same time, I felt fear growing inside me. I knew the waiting time was running out. My patience was reaching its limit. I didn't want to be the woman waiting for the love of someone who didn't know if he wanted to give it to her. I wanted whole love, love without hesitation, without insecurities. And in that moment, I realized that as much as I loved this man, I also needed to respect myself. What he offered wasn't enough to fill the void I felt. I needed more. I needed certainty. "I can't wait for you forever," I said, my voice firm, despite the pain consuming me. "I need something more, something real. I need to know you'll stay for real, no more hesitations." He stayed silent for a long moment, looking at me as if absorbing every word, every emotion I was pouring out. The silence stretched between us, heavier than any conversation we'd ever had. "I don't know what more I can offer you," he said, his voice breaking but sincere. "But if you give me one more chance, I'll show you I'm here to stay." It was the moment I knew would change everything. He was ready to commit, but I also knew that decision didn't depend on him alone. It depended on me. I was willing to give one more chance, but at the same time, I needed more than words. I needed actions. I needed trust. And in that moment, I realized our future wasn't in his hands anymore, but in mine. I could keep believing in his promise, or take a step back and protect myself from what could hurt me again. I didn't know what to expect from that moment. His words still echoed in my mind, but something had changed. I no longer doubted what he felt for me. I no longer doubted what his love meant. But even so, there was a sense of inevitability, as if we were on a path that couldn't be undone. He promised he wouldn't run anymore, but there was something in his eyes that told me words were just the beginning. the real change would need to come from his actions, from his willingness to give himself truly, without hesitation. The silence between us was heavy, but also charged with a kind of understanding we didn't need to express verbally. He stood there before me, with sincere eyes, without the defenses he usually raised, without the apologetic words he often offered. It was as if he had finally shown himself, no longer as the man afraid of love, but as someone willing to embrace the vulnerability, the fragility of being truly seen. His choice to stay, to not run, brought me something more important than any words. The confidence that he was willing to be different, to be the man he always knew he could be by my side. But I also knew that decision wouldn't be easy. I saw in his actions, in the small gestures, that he was still grappling with his own ghosts. The fear of failing again, was visible in his gaze. But there was something more there, something that told me he was ready to face those fears, not because he knew everything would work out, but because he was finally willing to try. And perhaps that was the greatest proof of change. He was no longer running. I, in turn, knew I couldn't keep one foot out of this story anymore. I had to give myself fully, without looking back, without hiding behind walls. The fear was still there, but the desire to live the present with him gave me more strength than doubt. The days following our conversation unfolded like a silent dance between us. He was there, day after day, showing through his actions that the promises made weren't empty. It wasn't just his physical presence, but the way he gave himself, allowed himself without the defenses he once used. I saw how much he was willing to change, and that brought me a sense of relief and at the same time a growing anxiety. Because as much as I wanted to believe everything was different, part of me still feared what might come next. But looking at him, something inside me calmed. He was there, truly there, like never before. Yet there were moments when, even with all the sincerity of his actions, the shadow of the past still loomed over us. Small details like a diverted glance or a hesitation in making an important decision made me doubt. I knew he was doing his best, but something told me he was still fighting his own fears and insecurities. And deep down, part of me was fighting too, fighting not to close myself off again, fighting not to fall into the temptation of protecting myself, of returning to the comfort of the solitude I knew so well. But I knew I couldn't. I knew that if I truly wanted to live what was beginning, to blossom between us, I'd have to open my heart fully without hesitation. One of those nights, after a small argument about a travel plan, he stopped at my apartment door, his eyes more intense than ever. He looked tired, as if the words about to come out had needed to be said for a long time. "I know you feel I'm still distant, but I don't want to be that guy anymore," he said, his voice hoarse, as if the confession were a weight he'd carried for too long. I looked at him, and for the first time, I realized the distance wasn't between us anymore. It was inside me, in my hesitation, in my fear of giving myself completely. "I know," I replied, my voice soft but firm. "But what are you going to do with it, with those fears?" He looked at me, silent for a moment, and the pain reflected in his eyes made my chest tighten. But he didn't look away. He didn't pull back. It was in that moment that I realized the true transformation was happening. It wasn't just about him or me. It was about us, about what we were willing to give, to build. He was offering me something I never thought possible, the promise to be vulnerable, to be true, not because he knew it would be perfect, but because he was willing to face his flaws, his insecurities, and still be there by my side. I looked at him and saw a different man. Not the man who'd run before, but someone who was there, ready to face his fears, ready to take responsibility for being someone better. "I'm here," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "And I'll stay, no matter what happens." There were no more empty promises in his words, only the sincerity of a decision made. And in that moment, I felt something inside me change. I knew I also had to make a decision. If I wanted the future beginning to unfold before us, I'd also need to give myself, to accept the risk of failing. And with a deep breath, I did it. I took the next step. No more fears, no more hesitation. There were no fireworks, no grand declarations, no embellished promises or vows of eternal love. There was only the raw, unfiltered reality of two hearts that chose to stay, knowing the path would be imperfect. It was on that gray, unglamorous morning, without witnesses, that I fully understood what it meant to love someone. I watched him making coffee, with his wrinkled shirt and messy hair, and realized it wasn't the promise that he'd never make me suffer that mattered, but the simple fact that he was there, not running, not hiding, not trying to be anything other than who he truly was. I approached slowly, as if knowing I was treading on sacred ground, and touched his hand, feeling the quiet strength of someone who chose to stay. He looked at me, and in that look was everything words could never translate: the inner struggle, the conscious decision, the courage to be imperfect and still worthy of love. I smiled, not the forced smile I'd used so many times to mask my insecurity, but a new, light, true smile. It was as if, in that small gesture, we were sealing a silent pact to face the good and bad days together, the fears and victories, without more running, without more excuses. It wasn't about perfection anymore, about control, about guarantees. It was about the daily choice to trust, to believe, to give. And in that moment, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. The pains of the past still existed, as did the fears, but now they no longer defined us. Love didn't promise immunity from pain, but it gave us the courage to face it together. And that was the difference between what we were and what we became. It wasn't the absence of fear that strengthened us. It was the commitment to move forward despite the fear. He approached, unhurried, and wrapped me in his arms with a gentleness that seemed to carry all the promises once broken and now being rebuilt, one by one. There, in that silent embrace, I understood fully. Love triumphed, not because it was perfect, but because we chose to stay. We chose to believe. We chose to love with all the flaws, all the scars, and despite everything. And for the first time, in a long time, my heart didn't feel at war. It felt at peace. The months passed like turning the pages of a well-read book, with respect, with care, with the awareness that every chapter, good or bad, was essential to building what we were. Now, life went on, with its highs and lows, its sunny days and storms, but something within us remained unshakable. It wasn't the illusion of perfection that kept us together, nor the hope of painless days. It was the simple, silent choice to keep walking side by side, even when the steps grew heavy. There were days when words failed, days when the old fears whispered in our ears again, trying to reopen wounds we closed with such effort. But on those days, we didn't choose bitter, silence, or distance. We chose presence, conversation, the firm touch that said without words, "I'm here, I'm still here." And that, more than anything, was the promise that never broke. At some point along the way, I realized the love we built wasn't the one I dreamed of when I was young. It was better. It was real. It was made of accepted imperfections, shared vulnerabilities, promises renewed with each new dawn. It was made of two human beings, broken and mended, who still chose to love with a fierce tenderness, without masks, without reservation. Today, when I look at him, when I see the way he smiles distractedly while reading a book, or how he reaches for me in the middle of the night, just to make sure I'm still there, I know love triumphed. Not because it was easy, not because it was infallible, but because, in the most crucial moment, we both chose to stay. We chose to be for each other what we'd always sought, a safe harbor in a world of uncertainties. And as we walked together, through the seasons yet to come, I no longer carry the fear of being left. I carry only the quiet certainty that whatever happens, we are a home. A home made of daily choices, small gestures, and silent love that, against all odds, chose to triumph.